There are moments in life that seem small when they happen. Moments so
I worked
ordinary
years
that
to buy my
nobody
dream
expects
car.
them to change
Cameras had
everything.
recorded everything.
A trip to the grocery
They
store.
laughed when I asked them
A
to take
walk through a
responsibility.
parking lot.
But minutes
simple
later,
glance out of a
security
window.
footage exposed the
For me,
truth,
it
and their
started
lives
on
were
a
about to change
bright
forever.
Saturday afternoon, after months of overtime and careful budgeting. I had finally purchased the car I had dreamed about for years. It wasn't a luxury sports car or some exotic vehicle that turned heads wherever it went. It was simply a beautiful new sedan that represented years of sacrifice, hard work, and discipline. Every payment had been earned through long shifts skipped, vacations, and countless weekends spent working while others enjoyed their free time. To most people, it was just another car. To me, it was proof that persistence eventually pays off. I treated it with care from the very first day. I parked far away from crowded areas. I washed it regularly. I kept the interior spotless. Every time I looked at it, I felt a sense of pride that only comes from earning something through your own effort. That Saturday, I drove to a shopping center on the edge of town. The parking lot was busy, but not overcrowded. As usual, I chose a space away from the main entrance to reduce the chances of someone parking too close to me. The afternoon felt peaceful. Families walked between stores. Carrying shopping bags, children ran ahead of their parents. Employees pushed carts back toward the supermarket. Everything seemed perfectly normal. I finished my shopping and headed toward the exit of the store, when something outside caught my attention. A loud voice echoed through the parking lot. Even from a distance, it was impossible to miss. Near my row of parking spaces stood a woman who looked like she believed the entire world existed for her convenience. Her expensive clothes, oversized sunglasses, and constant dramatic gestures drew attention from everyone around her. Beside her stood a teenage boy, perhaps 16 or 17 years old. The resemblance was unmistakable. The same arrogant posture, the same expression of superiority, the same confidence that came from never hearing the word no. The woman was busy arguing with an employee over something trivial. People nearby were staring while trying to pretend they weren't listening. Meanwhile, her son seemed bored. He wandered away from her and began walking through the parking lot. At first, I paid little attention. Then I noticed something that made me stop. The teenager was dragging a metal object along the side of parked vehicles. My stomach tightened at first. I hoped I was mistaken. Maybe it wasn't touching the cars. Maybe I was seeing things from the wrong angle. But then I heard it. The unmistakable sound of metal scraping against paint. A sharp, ugly sound that instantly made every car owner's heart sink. The teenager moved casually between vehicles, dragging what appeared to be a key along doors and panels as if he were absent-mindedly drawing lines on paper. One car, then another, then another. I felt disbelief turn into anger. Surely someone would stop him. Surely his mother would notice. Surely he wouldn't be foolish enough to damage his property in broad daylight. But nobody intervened. The few people who noticed seemed uncertain about what they had seen. Others were too distracted to pay attention. Then the teenager reached my car. Time seemed to slow. I watched as he glanced around briefly before dragging the object. Across the driver's side door, the metallic scraping sound pierced through the parking lot. A deep scratch stretched across the flawless paint. For a second, I couldn't move. Months of hard work, years of saving, damaged in seconds. Because someone else's child thought it was entertaining. The teenager smirked. Not a nervous smile. Not the expression of someone who made a mistake. It was the look of someone who enjoyed getting away with something. Anger surged through me. I immediately headed toward the parking lot. By the time I reached my vehicle, the teenager had already returned to his mother. The scratch was worse than I imagined. It wasn't a minor mark. It wasn't something that could be buffed out. The paint had been deeply gouged from one end of the door to the other. My hands clenched into fists. I looked across the parking lot toward the teenager and his mother. The responsible thing would have been simple: an apology, an admission, a willingness to pay for the damage. Instead, I was about to discover exactly what kind of people they were. I approached calmly and explained what I had witnessed. The mother's reaction was immediate. Her expression transformed from confusion to outrage in seconds. Not outrage directed at her son, outrage directed at me. She behaved as though I'd committed some terrible offense simply by suggesting that her child might be responsible for wrongdoing. The teenager stood silently beside her, not denying anything, not apologizing, just watching. The mother's voice grew louder and louder. Soon, people were looking in our direction. She insisted her son would never do such a thing, she claimed. I was targeting him unfairly. She accused me of making assumptions. She even suggested I was trying to scam them. The entire performance felt rehearsed, as if this wasn't the first time. She had defended her son's behavior regardless of the facts. Meanwhile, the teenager continued standing there with that same smug expression, the expression of someone who believed there would be no consequences. Eventually, the mother demanded proof. Without proof, she insisted, there was nothing anyone could do. And, technically, she was right. I had seen what happened, but my word alone might not be enough. Several bystanders had witnessed portions of the incident, yet none seemed eager to become involved. The woman recognized this. Her confidence grew stronger with every passing second. She acted as though the situation was already won, as though her son's innocence had somehow been established simply because she said so. The encounter ended with her grabbing her shopping bags and storming toward her vehicle. The teenager followed closely behind as they left. I noticed him looking back toward me. There was amusement in his eyes, the kind of amusement that comes from believing you've escaped accountability. Their SUV pulled away from the parking lot. I stood beside my damaged car, feeling frustrated and helpless. Then something unexpected happened. A security employee from one of the nearby stores approached me. He had apparently witnessed part of the argument from a distance. After listening to a brief explanation, he asked a simple question. Had I checked whether the parking lot cameras covered that section? For a moment, I simply stared at him. Parking lot cameras. The thought hadn't even crossed my mind. The employee pointed towards several security cameras mounted on light poles throughout the lot. One of them appeared to face directly toward my parking space. Suddenly, everything changed. The confidence, the arrogance, the smug smile, the mother's certainty, the teenager's amusement, all of it depended on one thing: the assumption that nobody could prove what happened. But if those cameras had recorded the incident, proof existed, and if proof existed, consequences were coming. I looked up at the camera mounted high above the parking lot. For the first time since discovering the scratch, I felt something replacing my frustration. Hope, because somewhere inside a security office, a recording might already be waiting, and neither the spoiled teenager nor his mother had any idea that their worst mistake wasn't scratching my car. Their worst mistake was doing it in front of cameras that never blinked. The moment I learned there might be security footage, the entire situation changed. Only minutes earlier, I had felt powerless. The scratch across my car door wasn't just damage to a vehicle. It was damage to something I had worked hard to earn. Watching the teenager walk away without consequences had left me feeling frustrated and defeated. Now there was a possibility that the truth had been recorded. The security employee explained that the shopping center maintained multiple cameras throughout the parking lot. Not every area was covered perfectly, but several angles overlapped. If I was lucky, one of those cameras had captured everything. The employee directed me toward the property management office located near the rear of the shopping center. I immediately headed there. As I walked, I kept replaying the encounter in my mind. The mother's angry accusations, the teenager's smug expression, the certainty with which they had dismissed me. They hadn't acted like people who feared consequences. They had acted like people who had never experienced consequences. Inside the management office, I explained what had happened. The manager listened carefully while examining photographs of the damage I had taken on my phone. When I mentioned the possibility of security footage, his expression became serious. He informed me that footage could only be released under certain circumstances, especially if a police report was involved. That was enough for me. I contacted the local police department and reported the incident. An officer arrived within the hour. After inspecting the damage, taking photographs, and collecting my statement, he agreed that reviewing the footage would be the logical next step. The waiting felt endless. The officer and property manager entered a security room while I remained outside. Every minute seemed longer than the last. I wasn't just waiting for evidence. I was waiting to find out whether justice would actually happen. Too many people get away with bad behavior. There isn't enough proof. Too many victims are told to move on because nobody can verify what happened. I hoped this wouldn't be one of those situations. Nearly 30 minutes later, the officer emerged. His expression told me everything before he spoke. They had footage, clear footage, very clear footage. Relief washed over me instantly. The officer explained that multiple cameras had captured the teenager walking through the parking lot. Not only had the cameras recorded him scratching my vehicle, but they had also recorded him damaging several other cars before reaching mine. The footage showed him dragging a key along vehicle after vehicle. There was no ambiguity, no confusion, no room for alternative explanations. The evidence was undeniable. The officer asked if I would be willing to provide a formal statement and pursue charges. Without hesitation, I agreed. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about anger. It was about accountability. Actions have consequences. If nobody ever teaches that lesson, society suffers because of it. The officer informed me that investigators would identify the teenager using vehicle registration information from the SUV his mother drove away in. Considering the quality of the footage, he seemed confident the case would move quickly. I drove home feeling far more optimistic than I had earlier. For the first time all day, I believed the truth would prevail. I had no idea the story was only beginning. 2 days later, I received a phone call from the investigating officer. The teenager and his mother had been located. The conversation that followed surprised me. Apparently, when contacted by police, the mother had reacted exactly as she had in the parking lot. Denial, anger, accusations, claims that her son was being unfairly targeted. The officer explained that she remained completely confident until investigators mentioned the security footage. Then everything changed. The confidence disappeared almost immediately. Suddenly, the story shifted. The teenager supposedly hadn't meant any harm. It had been a misunderstanding, a childish mistake, an accident. The explanations became more desperate as the evidence became more undeniable. But the footage spoke for itself. There was nothing accidental about scratching multiple vehicles across an entire parking lot. The officer informed me that several other vehicle owners had already been identified. Once contacted, they discovered damage matching what appeared on the recordings. The teenager's actions had affected far more people than I originally realized. What I had witnessed wasn't an isolated incident. It was a deliberate act of vandalism. 1 victim became 3. 3 became 6. Eventually, investigators identified nearly a dozen damaged vehicles. The financial consequences were growing rapidly. Repair estimates began arriving. Several scratches required complete repainting of vehicle panels. Others involved blending paint. Across multiple sections, costs climbed into thousands of dollars. The more information emerged, the worse the situation became for the teenager and his mother. Yet even then, she continued trying to avoid responsibility, according to the officer. She insisted everyone was exaggerating. She complained about unfair treatment. She argued that teenagers make mistakes. She focused almost entirely on protecting her son from consequences rather than acknowledging the damage done to others. It became increasingly clear how the teenager had developed such an attitude. Children learn accountability from parents. When parents excuse every action, accountability never develops. Weeks passed, the case continued moving forward. Then something unexpected happened. I received a phone call from an attorney. The attorney represented the teenager's family. At first, I assumed they wanted to discuss compensation. Instead, the attorney asked whether I would consider dropping the matter. The request stunned me. The family apparently feared the legal consequences that were beginning to take shape. They worried about civil claims. They worried about criminal records. They worried about financial liability. Most importantly, they worried about reputation. The attorney attempted to frame the situation as a youthful mistake that should not permanently affect the teenager's future. Part of me understood the argument. Everyone makes mistakes. Everyone deserves opportunities to learn and grow. But there was a problem. Growth requires accountability. Learning requires consequences. Neither had occurred. Not once had the teenager apologized. Not once had his mother accepted responsibility. Not once had they voluntarily offered to repair the damage. Every step of the process had required evidence, pressure, and legal involvement. Without the cameras, they would have walked away laughing. That fact mattered. I politely declined. The attorney thanked me and ended the conversation. Several days later, more information surfaced. One of the damaged vehicles belonged to an elderly man living on a fixed income. Another belonged to a single mother who had been saving for months to repair unrelated mechanical issues. For them, vandalism wasn't merely inconvenient. It created genuine financial hardship. Hearing those stories strengthened my resolve. This case wasn't just about my car anymore. It was about everyone affected by the teenager's choices. Meanwhile, rumors about the incident began spreading throughout the community. The shopping center employees talked. Vehicle owners talked. Witnesses talked. Soon, many local residents knew about the teenager, caught vandalizing cars on camera. The family that once appeared untouchable was suddenly facing public scrutiny. For the first time, consequences were reaching beyond repair bills. Reputation was becoming part of the equation, and that appeared to bother the mother more than anything else. She had spent years cultivating an image of perfection, an image of success, an image of superiority. Now, people were beginning to see a different reality. The cracks in that image were becoming impossible to hide, but the greatest surprise was still ahead, because investigators had not finished reviewing all the footage as they continued examining recordings from that day. They discovered something that would completely destroy the family's defense. Something that would prove the teenager's actions weren't random. Something that would reveal exactly what kind of person he had become. And once that evidence came to light, the consequences would become far more severe than anyone expected. By the time the investigation reached its third week, most people believed the case was straightforward. A spoiled teenager had vandalized. Several vehicles, security, cameras had captured the evidence. The victims would be compensated. The teenager would face legal consequences. The end, at least. That was what everyone assumed, but reality turned out to be much more complicated. Investigators continued reviewing footage from every available camera throughout the shopping center. Their original goal was simply to document all the damaged vehicles and establish a complete timeline. Instead, they uncovered something far more disturbing. What appeared at first to be a reckless act of vandalism was beginning to look like a pattern of behavior. The teenager had not arrived at the shopping center and suddenly decided to scratch a few cars out of boredom. The recordings showed something different, something intentional. Several cameras captured the teenager walking through the parking lot long before he started damaging vehicles. He wasn't wandering aimlessly. He was observing, watching, selecting targets. When investigators analyzed the footage frame by frame, a clear pattern emerged. The teenager ignored older vehicles. He ignored cars with visible wear and tear. He focused almost exclusively on newer vehicles. Vehicles that owners clearly cared about. Vehicles that appeared expensive or well-maintained. The realization disturbed everyone involved. This wasn't random mischief. This was deliberate. The teenager seemed to enjoy damaging things that mattered to other people. The officer handling the case later explained that this detail changed how investigators viewed the incident. Intent matters, and the footage suggested intent far beyond simple carelessness. Then they discovered another recording, a recording that made the situation dramatically worse. One of the shopping center cameras covered an area near the food court entrance. Several minutes before the vandalism began, the teenager had been sitting alone on a bench while his mother shopped. The camera had no audio, but it clearly showed his actions. Investigators watched as he removed a key from his pocket. They watched him examine it, twirl it between his fingers, look around the parking lot, then smile. Moments later, he stood up and walked directly toward the rows of vehicles. The sequence was impossible to ignore. There was planning involved, not extensive. Planning, not criminal mastermind planning, but enough to demonstrate deliberate intent. The teenager wasn't acting impulsively. He made a conscious decision. That evidence significantly strengthened the case. When confronted with the new footage, the family's attorney reportedly became much less confident. The argument that everything had been an accident was effectively destroyed. Meanwhile, repair estimates continued arriving from affected vehicle owners. The total cost kept growing: $5,000, $7,000, $10,000. Then higher. Every newly identified victim increased the financial damage. The mother who had once laughed off accusations now faced the possibility of enormous liability. For the first time, reality was becoming impossible to avoid. Yet what happened next shocked even me. One afternoon, I received a call from one of the other victims. We had exchanged contact information through investigators. He wanted to share something important. Apparently, this wasn't the first time the teenager had been involved in troubling behavior. Several community members had begun sharing stories after learning about the incident. Small stories, unpleasant stories, stories that never resulted in serious consequences. Bullying classmates, destroying school property, harassing younger children, damaging neighborhood decorations. None of the incidents had been severe enough individually to create major legal problems, but together they painted a disturbing picture, a pattern of entitlement, a pattern of disrespect, a pattern of believing rules applied to everyone except him. According to multiple people, his mother had responded the same way every time: defend, deny, blame others. Excuse behavior, avoid. Accountability over and over again. Suddenly, everything made sense. The teenager hadn't developed his attitude overnight. Years of unchecked behavior had slowly created it. Every excuse reinforced it. Every avoided consequence strengthened it. Every denial encouraged it. The shopping center incident wasn't the beginning of the problem. It was simply the first time. Undeniable evidence existed. As public discussion intensified, community opinion shifted rapidly. People who once admired the family began distancing themselves. Parents remembered incidents involving their children, neighbors remembered property disputes, former acquaintances recalled unpleasant encounters. The family's carefully maintained reputation started unraveling, and unlike the scratch on my car, this damage couldn't be repaired with paint. Then came the court hearing. The room wasn't packed, but enough people attended to create noticeable tension. Several victims were present. Investigators were present. Attorneys were present. The teenager and his mother were present. For the first time since the parking lot confrontation, I saw them again. The difference was remarkable. Gone was the confidence. Gone was the arrogance. Gone was the certainty that they could simply deny reality. The weight of evidence had changed everything. As footage was reviewed and reports were presented, the teenager spent most of the hearing staring downward. The mother looked exhausted. Months earlier, she had acted as though everyone else was the problem. Now she sat surrounded by undeniable proof. The consequences she had worked so hard to prevent were arriving anyway. One piece of evidence after another reinforced the same conclusion. Deliberate vandalism, multiple victims, substantial financial damage, clear video recordings, no credible dispute. The outcome became increasingly obvious. Although the teenager's age limited some potential penalties, accountability was unavoidable. Restitution would be required. Financial responsibility would be required. Additional consequences would follow for the victims. It represented validation, not victory, not revenge. Validation. The truth mattered, and the truth had prevailed. After the hearing concluded, many people assumed the story was finished. I assumed the same. The teenager had been caught. The evidence had spoken. Justice had been served. But life, as a way of delivering lessons long after legal proceedings end. Over the following months, the family faced consequences they never anticipated. Consequences no court could impose. Consequences created entirely by their own choices. The mother's social standing began deteriorating rapidly. Friends became distant. Community invitations stopped arriving. Business relationships became strained. People who once tolerated her behavior no longer felt obligated to do so. Trust, once lost, proved difficult to recover. Meanwhile, the teenager faced his own challenges. Schools, extracurricular activities, and future opportunities often require character references and reputational credibility. His actions had created obstacles that couldn't simply be erased. The consequences extended far beyond repair bills. And yet, despite everything, one final chapter remained unwritten because several months later, I would unexpectedly encounter the family again. This time, however, something was different. Something neither I nor anyone else expected. For the first time, genuine accountability might finally appear. But whether it came too late remained to be seen. Nearly 8 months passed before I saw them again. By then, life had mostly returned to normal. My car had been repaired long ago. The deep scratch that once stretched across the driver's side door had disappeared beneath fresh paint and professional restoration. Physically, there was no sign the incident had ever happened. But the lessons remained. Every so often, someone would mention the story. A neighbor, a coworker, another victim from the parking lot. The case had become one of those local stories people remembered because it demonstrated a simple truth. Actions eventually catch up with people, especially when they believe they are above consequences. Over time, I stopped thinking about the teenager and his mother. I assumed they had moved on with their lives. I certainly intended to move on with mine. Then one afternoon, fate placed us in the same location again. I was attending a community fundraiser hosted at a local recreation center. The event supported several charitable programs. including assistance for elderly residents and educational opportunities for underprivileged students. Hundreds of people attended. Families walked between booths. Volunteers organized activities. Local businesses sponsored displays. It was exactly the kind of event that brought the community together. I spent most of the afternoon helping at a fundraising table as the crowd moved through the center. A familiar face suddenly caught my attention. The teenager, at first. I almost didn't recognize him. Several months had changed him considerably. His posture looked different. His expression looked different. Even the confidence that once bordered on arrogance seemed gone. For a moment, I wondered whether I was mistaken then. I saw the woman beside him, his mother. There was no doubt it was the same family. Yet something felt completely different. The transformation wasn't physical. It was emotional. The woman who once stormed through a parking lot shouting accusations now appeared unusually quiet. The teenager who once smirked after damaging property now seemed uncomfortable, drawing attention to himself as they moved through the event. I noticed something else. Many attendees recognized them. Some offered polite greetings. Others simply nodded. But the enthusiastic warmth that once surrounded them seemed absent. Reputations take years to build, only moments to damage. The consequences of their choices had lingered. For several minutes, I debated whether to approach them. Part of me preferred avoiding unnecessary interaction. The incident belonged in the past. There was no reason to reopen old wounds. Then something unexpected happened. The teenager noticed me for a brief second. Our eyes met across the room. Recognition was immediate. I expected awkwardness, perhaps embarrassment. Instead, I witnessed something I never anticipated. Regret, genuine regret. The kind that cannot be faked. The kind that only develops after someone fully understands the consequences of their actions. A few moments later, he quietly separated from the crowd and walked in my direction. His mother remained several steps behind. Neither appeared eager, neither appeared comfortable. Yet they continued approaching. The entire situation felt surreal. Months earlier, the same family had denied reality despite overwhelming evidence. Now they looked like people carrying a burden. They could no longer ignore. What followed surprised me more than anything else in the entire story. For the first time since the incident, accountability finally appeared. Not because lawyers demanded it, not because courts required it, not because security footage forced it, but because reality had finally taught a lesson that excuses could no longer prevent. The teenager looked older than he had months before. Not physically, emotionally. Some experiences accelerate maturity. Consequences are among them, without offering excuses, without blaming others, and without attempting to justify what happened. He acknowledged responsibility for the damage he caused. The arrogance that once defined him seemed gone. In its place stood someone who finally understood that every action affects real people. Every careless decision creates consequences. Every moment of selfishness leaves a mark somewhere. His mother stood nearby, for perhaps the first time. She wasn't defending him. She wasn't arguing. She wasn't denying facts. She wasn't accusing anyone else. She simply listened. The silence itself spoke volumes. Sometimes life teaches lessons that pride cannot survive. According to what I later learned, the months following the court proceedings had been extremely difficult for their family. The financial consequences were substantial. Insurance complications followed. Community reputation suffered. Relationships became strained. Opportunities disappeared. The costs extended far beyond money. Most importantly, they could no longer escape the truth. Every consequence traced back to one decision. A decision that should never have happened. Ironically, the cameras they once feared had done more than prove guilt. They had exposed a deeper low BLEM's lack of accountability. Without those recordings, the teenager likely would have continued believing he could do whatever he wanted. His mother likely would have continued, protecting him from every consequence. The cycle would have continued. Instead, reality interrupted it, painfully, publicly. But, effectively, as our interaction ended, I found myself reflecting on something important. Many people misunderstand karma. They imagine dramatic revenge, instant punishment, spectacular downfall. Real karma often works differently. Real karma is watching years of excuses collapse under the weight of truth. Real karma is realizing that every shortcut eventually leads somewhere you don't want to go. Real karma is understanding that character matters long after a specific incident ends. The teenager's greatest consequence wasn't financial, it wasn't legal, it wasn't public embarrassment. It was being forced to confront the person he had become, and then deciding whether to remain that person. Thankfully, it appeared he had chosen a different path. As the fundraiser continued, I watched the family volunteer at several community booths, not for attention, not for recognition, simply to help. Maybe they were rebuilding their reputation. Maybe they were rebuilding themselves. Either way, it represented progress. The event eventually ended. People packed equipment, volunteers cleaned up. Families headed home. As I walked toward my car that evening, I paused for a moment. The setting sun reflected off the paint. The repaired door looked perfect. No scratch remained. Yet I realized something interesting. The damaged paint had never been the real story. The real story was accountability. The real story was truth. The real story was what happens when people spend years avoiding consequences and suddenly discover that evidence doesn't care about excuses. The spoiled teenager scratched my car, believing nobody would stop him. His mother defended him, believing nobody could prove anything. Neither of them expected cameras. Neither of them expected consequences. And neither of them expected that those consequences would ultimately teach a lesson more valuable than any punishment. Because in the end, the cameras recorded more than vandalism. They recorded the moment a lifetime of excuses finally came to an end. And that was something no amount of denial could erase.